Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking IVCO 2023 blog post. This session, much like every other episode, is to give everyone bite-sized pieces of IVCO 2023's informative and exciting blogs. My name is Kuala. I am an alumni of Yayasan Sukarelawan Siswa YSS, and in this 9th episode of Unpacking IVCO 2023 blog post, we have Dr. Cliff Allum here with us from the Third Sector Research Centre of the University of Birmingham, UK, to talk about his blog piece, The Role of International Volunteering and Cooperation Organizations, IVCOs, in Developing Youth-Led Volunteering Development. Hi, Dr. Allum, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself and say hello to the audience?
Yes, thanks, Walla. Thanks for asking me to do this blog post. My name's Cliff Allum. I'm delighted to do this blog. Open this discussion. I'm sorry I won't be there at the conference with you, but I'd just like to say a little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me, and there'll be many of you that don't. I'm a writer and researcher on volunteering. I'm connected with the University of Birmingham, the Third Sector Research Centre in the UK, which I've been connected to for a few years now. But before then, I was a practitioner. I worked in volunteering for development and in development practice. I was a CEO of a UK-based organisation called Skillshare International. I've had a long association with FORUM and attended many of the IVCO conferences over the years. And I've written some things around youth volunteering and looked at that as an issue over the past period. So I live in the UK, and I think that's enough about me. Voila.
Oh, that's very sad to hear that you cannot make it to this year's conference in Kuala Lumpur. Have you been to KL, Doctor?
No, I've not. I've been to, in the past, I've been to Singapore briefly, a couple of times, but I've been to sort of closest I've been is probably Cambodia.
Oh, okay.
So that part of the world, but I'm disappointed not to go somewhere new that I've not been before, but that's how it goes.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much for the brief introduction. So about your blog post, let's get on to the first question. Right. So with your extensive experience in the sector, what has changed over the past decades in the international landscape of volunteering for development? And what does this shift mean for youth participation?
Well, I've got this could take a long time to explain, so I'm going to do something that's going to basically give an overview.
Yes.
And obviously some of the details are going to vary, and it's never as clear and as clean as I'm going to talk about it. But it's important for everyone to know that when international volunteering was developed in the 1950s into the 1960s, in that period which we can track back from today's volunteering program, we track back to there, it was a youth program. It was also described as a technical assistance program. So young volunteers were being sent out from their home countries into other parts of the world as part of a technical assistance program. For example, Peace Corps, which was largely based on the US International Voluntary Service Program, dominated all of this numerically, and the American International Voluntary Service had emerged as a response to the impact of the Second World War with programs in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. And then Peace Corps took on this role, but it was mainly young people. In Europe, the volunteer program grew alongside, also as part of institutional arrangements of technical assistance. And this sense of technical assistance started to generate a division, and some organizations started to spin off away from volunteering, calling themselves consultancies or professionalizing or moving out of volunteering altogether into mainstream development. And the requirements during this period, like sort of the last quarter of the last century, the requirements in the global south began to change, and volunteers' experience and expertise was demanded. The volunteers became older, and gradually the number of youth volunteers diminished. And so we get to the beginning of this century where the average age of volunteers has gone from sort of something in their early 20s to something in their late 30s from the global north. And the requirements with this change from the global south meant that many organizations were thinking, we need to change. We need to think about how we're doing this work, how we don't want to keep sending the same volunteers year after year. We need to reinvent ourselves, and the Norwegians, Norec, reinvented themselves and their model to embrace young people more. And then donors started to press for youth programs in Germany and the UK especially, but other places, to say, what's happening to young people? Why can't young people have any volunteering opportunities? We need to do something about this. So we saw the emergence of some large-scale youth programs. And so we've got two of these trends happening here. One is for volunteering generally, volunteering for development, which is on the one hand aimed at development targets, focusing on high levels of expertise and focused on development outcomes. Well, to some extent on global learning. But the question is for young people, where do young people fit into that? And then impact of COVID, I have to mention in more recent times, means that it had a particular impact on the youth programs. A lot of the youth programs were pulled back and closed down. And now we're seeing some new thinking. And now we're seeing, well, what's going to happen in the future? And the question is, that's still to play for. So this IVCO is very timely because this is the opportunity really to try and get IVCOs to rethink some of their approaches to youth volunteering.
Yeah. Just a reminder to everyone that this year's theme for IVCO is a new generation of volunteers as change makers. So thank you so much for that, for your explanation, Dr. Allum. So you talked about the disconnect between IVCOs and youth volunteering. Why is that? What were the challenges that they faced in adapting to the evolving priorities and dynamics of youth volunteering?
I think I touched on it just now to an extent. I think there's a contradiction. And it's a contradiction where the IVCOs find themselves in the midst of. Generally speaking, IVCOs have been from the global north, not exclusively, but have tended to be from the global north. They're working with partners in the global south. If we go back sort of, 30, 40 years, you would see the need for maybe there's not many teachers in certain countries, and there'll be large-scale teacher programs, for example. That perspective changed, and the idea is that local people should be teachers. It shouldn't be sourcing it from the global north. We should be looking at how the local people do this. And the global north IVCOs became more focused on building capacity and doing more expertise. So gradually, the roles of volunteers became, should we say, more of an expertise role than they had been previously. And that meant the focus of the pressure to focus volunteering on development goals, development objectives, meant where was the space for young people to fit in this? And the issue of young people and youth volunteering didn't feature at IVCO conferences, for example, until fairly recently, the last 6-7 years. And it wasn't part of the work, because the work was about providing the expertise into the global south. Young people didn't fit into that. And then the other side of it is youth volunteering was somewhat set on a different course, especially organizations run by young people for young people. And that didn't really match up to the structures of governance of IVCO, some of whom are government departments, some of whom are sort of significant large-scale non-governmental organizations. So that really didn't match up. You couldn't have a sense in which young people were running such organizations unless they were specialist youth organizations. So I think those are the kind of problems. That one is about the nature of the programs that IVCOs were trying to run. The other one is, could their structures of governance and management really embrace youth-led initiatives as against involving young people in the IVCO structures?
Yeah. So repeating on that last point that you've mentioned, you've argued in the blog post that IVCOs have tended to face both ways when it comes to the purpose of youth volunteering programs. often prioritizing the development of young people as global citizens over contributing to development outcomes in the global south. So with regards to the purpose of youth volunteering programs, what are the dilemma that IVCOs are facing, and how does that impact or influence their approach to development goals? How do we connect those two?
Sure. The some of it I've mentioned, but let me sort of go into a little bit more detail. Some of the large-scale youth programs are essentially supply-driven.
Mm-hmm.
And this doesn't easily match up to the demand-driven approach that IVCOs use. And it means that it becomes more challenging in the sense to have, when it's supply-driven, to have meaningful development opportunities for young people to engage with. So the more people you have to put through the system, as it were, the less opportunities there are that are of quality that are going to be there. That's a tough decision. It's not necessarily that IVCOs have chosen that route. It's because their donors have contracted them to do that work. So even developing youth leadership in the global south has its challenges, because that can also mean taking young people out of their own communities, and that can have a negative impact as well. But the other question here is, do the programs that IVCO run or are used to running really match up to the issues young people are interested in, and how do they engage? For example, do IVCO's programs really focus on, say, sport and drama, which I certainly found in my experience young people were particularly connected to? Or how does social media integrate with the IVCO practice? I can remember IVCOs thinking having a phone was a problem, whereas to some extent that is how young people connect. So there is an issue about how do we engage with that. We have emergent industries, emergent activities that I wonder if they're on the radar of IVCOs at the present time, and I think this is part of the challenge. For example, how IVCOs are relating to this fantastic expansion of esports, which is generating hugely significant broadcasting and technical skills for young people. There are no old people with these skills. These are all people in their 20s in the global north. And these are interesting areas that are growing and developing. And my question for the IVCOs is, are IVCOs sufficiently agile to keep pace with these kind of changes and relate them to development goals? How open are IVCOs to innovation? And I think if we're going to address and support youth volunteering and young people to have genuine opportunities, we have to be really, as IVCOs, open to innovative opportunities.
So in that context, what are the development goals that we can try to strive for when we do that?
Well, the way in which this is constructed at the present time, I think to some extent with youth programs, is that it's about global learning. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that the opportunity of young people in the global south learning from young people in the global north and vice versa. There is an issue about equitability in that. Yeah. Because clearly, what do the youth of the global south learn from visiting youth from the global north? And to what extent do they get the reciprocity, the opportunity of learning in the global north? So there's that piece of that global learning. We have it's IVCOs are faced by a challenge that South-North volunteering is often blocked by government policies and visa requirements. It's very, very difficult on occasions, and some IVCOs have attempted to do that and do a little bit more. The Developed Arts Programme in Germany have attempted to do more South-North volunteering. NORAC will do more South-North volunteering, but in some other places the climate is just not there. So sometimes that is better maybe expressed to look at South-South connections. Maybe international volunteers do not have to come from the global north. There's an increasing number that are coming from the global south. Is that a more fruitful model for equitable learning? Not always straightforward, because there are power relationships there and we have to be well aware of. But the piece in this as well is the access to programs. And if we look at who the people are that access international volunteering opportunities, they tend to come from richer, more well-educated middle classes. And how do we make sure that these programs are open to a wider group of society?
Yep, I agree. So now let's talk about youth-led initiatives in the global south. what role can young international volunteers play to support these programs, and what can IVCO do to facilitate this engagement?
I think there's we all have a key challenge in our lives, and we're all impacted by the society in which we grow up. We learn attitudes, we learn perspectives, we learn views. I think there is a sense that volunteers, from youth volunteers in the global north with life experience they have at the time, if they're young, will probably, in my experience, very often have a perspective that they're going there to enable the people in the global south to learn. My experience of volunteering for development generally is that if volunteers go with that view, that soon gets challenged by the lived experience of volunteers of all ages. Many volunteers who go from the global north to the global south say, I learned a lot more than I was ever able to give to other people. And I think that's a piece we have to bear in mind. And it's quite challenging that some of the youth programs are quite short stay. They might be, sort of 3 months or 6 months or something of that kind. It's a limited amount of time to enable that kind of learning from that experience. And we have to ask the question, is it appropriate to send young people to have that sense of entitlement? They might learn about the communities where they are based, but what does that mean that people learn in those communities? And that's not clear. So I think the question you've raised about the role for international volunteers must be led from the global south. It shouldn't be led as a supply-driven program from the global north. And even in the South-South arrangements, we need to understand the power dynamics between countries. And therefore, IVCOs really need to be astute, I think, in exploring whether or not there is prejudicial views in relation to the contribution of young people. And this is around awareness. It's about whether it's conscious or unconscious bias. We have to be aware that there may be a sense of, well, what can young people really contribute? And young people, contribute hugely to the future of the world, and will contribute hugely to the future of the world. But the role of IVCOs here is to ensure they're really listening and hearing but from young people, what they see as the priorities and what they see are the important things to do. And so the starting point for me is that IVCOs need to consider that youth-led initiatives in the global south are the active drivers, not the beneficiaries of a global north program. And this needs to be at the center. And in that sense, what would that mean in practice? Well, it would mean in practice, I think, that IVCOs are perhaps best placed to work with infrastructure organizations, volunteering involving organizations, but on the terms of those organizations. There's some history in development which is not great, whereby people have sponsored support infrastructure organizations and then really made them dependent on the donors. That's not great. So the question is being very, very sensitive to ensuring that it is on the agenda of the infrastructure organizations. And they could be quite informal. They could be small VIOs. They could be sort of governmental structures. They could be whatever, but making sure that that's the starting point, and that's where the active where the active drivers of the program are placed. So I think that's probably how I would look at that.
All right. This is probably just a further topic, not quite further, but you've touched on this topic from your previous pieces, I think. Youth volunteering roles in addressing climate change and sustainability. And what I've been seeing right now is that they don't really call themselves as volunteers. When you've mentioned that youth volunteers are the active drivers of development, so these particular societies and organizations, youth-led, the initiatives are focusing and centered on sustainability and climate change, but they never really see themselves as volunteers, because in their idea, the idea of volunteering is for society. But when they talk about climate change and sustainability, when it is so specific, they are just calling themselves as social organizations. So how do we readdress this in the international youth volunteering programs for development?
I think the question it's a very well, that's a really good question. I think the issue is that the term volunteer is not well understood globally. It's understood differently in different places. In other words, people who some people would describe as volunteers do not describe themselves as volunteers, and that's not at all unusual, and it happens globally. So I don't think we should be overly worried about that in terms of the terminology, because I think, you know, we're back to a conversation around, is the term volunteer culturally imposed on different communities, different societies, and if we get stuck on the fact that we need them to be called volunteers in order to, or to call themselves volunteers in order to engage, then of course that is that may be talking to the decolonization debate. And I think we need to make sure that we are, you know, not stuck with that. And I think the issue is, I think this is the question, is we're talking here around saying we're working with youth organizations. If an IVCO is working with a youth organization, it doesn't really matter, I suspect, to the IVCO whether those young people are, in that sense, volunteers. What they're engaged in is likely to be some level of voluntary action or voluntary activity on climate change, for example. And the question then becomes, what is the role of the IVCO in relation to those volunteers? And the challenge is to say, well, if the IVCO is a voluntary organisation, but it can actually work with, and often does, work with people who aren't volunteers. That's not unusual. The question will be, which we asked earlier, is, well, where does that mean international volunteers fit in, volunteers from other countries? Well, they themselves may not see themselves as volunteers, but they would see the IVCOs as a route to becoming engaged and connected. If we take, for example, let me give you another example of that, so that maybe people would like a practical example. I mentioned NOREC a couple of times. NOREC have a model which means that they talk about participants. They don't talk about volunteers. And the participants on the program are people that are a combination of volunteers, combinations of employees. They come together, they bring people together from different organizations in different countries, and they support that as a partnership within which people are engaged in activities that go beyond their normal, everyday, lived, working arrangements. So in a sense, there's a voluntary activity involved in that process. But they use the term participants. So I think there's a conversation to be had about that. I think IVCO no doubt will continue, and always has done, had conversations about the use of the terminology of volunteer. But I think when we come around to climate action, we're talking about young people taking action as active citizens in their own countries and other countries. And certainly I would say that can be seen to embrace an overarching sense of what voluntary action is about. They're not being paid to do that. They're doing it because they care about the planet, because they care about the future of the world. And that seems to me to be absolutely fine and totally within the volunteer tradition.
Thank you, Dr. Allum. So my last question would be, we're living in an almost borderless society, globalization and migration, particularly refugee migration, and these are pushing us to rethink and reshape the models that we use in youth volunteering and global learning. There are different global contexts and different physical and virtual spaces and forms that we can take into account. And when talking about international volunteering program, there are questions of why go abroad when there are issues back home that need dire help. Are international volunteering programs getting redundant? Is it still significant? And amidst all this, how can IVCOs remain relevant and equitable?
Yeah, sure. I'm tempted to ask what you think on this one, as well as me. So maybe we can turn this into a little bit of a conversation as well. I think it's I think one of the things about this is the sources of why people volunteer internationally, whether you young people or old people or whatever, the reasons why they did that. I mean, you can go back to the impact of World War One for a tradition of Société Civile Internationale as a point where in Europe the destruction of certain communities in France and Germany during that time, especially where much of the world was fought, but not all of it, that there was a sense of people from a peace building, conscientious objective backgrounds, especially saying we're going to help those communities rebuild. It was international in the sense that they would cross border, maybe coming from the UK to France to Germany or from Switzerland or wherever. But that's a kind of solidarity approach to volunteering. I think to some extent, if we roll forward 100 years from there, approximately speaking, some people would say, well, volunteering has become a bit more of a commodity. We live in a society whereby, or societies very often, where people think I can buy a volunteering experience. And therefore, I expect to get this from it, I expect to get that from it. It's a very different kind of concept of volunteering as a commodity that you can purchase, as an opportunity that you can purchase, that rather than a process of solidarity of people working across borders. So we see different things happening here. One of those, for example, has given in the private sector is the emergence of what's called voluntourism, where people are offered that experience and they buy that experience, they pay for it, and they go and undertake it. So we have that trend, and it still remains that it's seen as a marketable opportunity, a profitable opportunity for some to sell those kinds of experiences. What we're looking at on the other side, when we're talking about things like the changes in the world that's going through, refugees, the migration movements, and so forth, which are, in a sense, disrupting certain kinds of ways in which societies have worked historically or in more recent times, but actually are a throwback to times when mass migrations were relatively common. If you go going back to whole histories of migrations in different parts of the world at different times. So we're looking at, for volunteering point of view, if you wanted to volunteer to assist, if it's a solidarity issue, then you have many opportunities. You do not have to travel halfway across the world to do that in the context of what's happening, whether or not you're in the USA or whether or not you're in Canada, or whether or not you're in Europe or whether or not you're in Asia. There are all sorts of opportunities there that are going on that require or would benefit from the active engagement of volunteers. One of the questions around, obviously there's a big question around volunteering and colonialism that's in volunteering for development that's taking a big discussion that's taking place. But one of the features of global learning is to experience and put yourselves in other people's shoes, to gain understanding of what life is like for others, the experience of the other. Now, there's opportunities, if you want to put it that way, that of expressing and engaging and understanding that, non-commercial, but through solidarity, which look concerned with people that have been involved in migration, concerned with people that are involved in refugee sort of experiences and status. And those, for the countries in the global north, those experiences are now on their own doorstep. They always have been, to some extent in more recent times, but now they're very in sharp relief. And there are issues around two pieces here to throw in. One is around the fact that we do have refugees in different parts of Europe, for example, where if we wanted to have volunteers from Europe, they could volunteer in Europe. Indeed, there is a program within the European Voluntary Service, but that is opportunities there. It doesn't need people to travel across the world. Okay, so if people are concerned around that kind of colonialism, north-south piece, whatever, then actually there's other ways of gaining that experience of the other. And in many places, you can do it within your own country. So why is the need to travel across the globe to do it? So that's one piece of it. The other question is, I just put is the issue of action, public engagement. Volunteering not just been about, and the traditions of the volunteering has not just been about saying, okay, I'm going to go and travel to another community, I'm going to do something of value in that other community, then I'm going to travel back. There's always been more to it than that. There's always been a sense that volunteers would engage with the general public, that would be advocates for a better world. And coming back to the climate change issue, that's about climate action. So IVCOs could be very well placed on in terms of climate change programs or climate action programs, that it's not just about, for example, which I talked about elsewhere, not just about going to work with the community to minimize the impact that climate change will have on them, but it's about raising those issues of concern, of advocacy, of influencing policymakers, and calling to account the governments that actually are responsible for, or the countries that are responsible for, and the firms that are responsible for the generation of the problem that we now face with climate change. And volunteers can play an important role in that. Again, they may not call themselves volunteer, they might call themselves climate activists, but they're essentially part of that active part of civil society that is attempting to generate awareness and understanding of the situation, the conditions, and the impact that this is having on people in different parts of the world. So I think, IVCOs can do that in different ways. You can support youth-led initiatives on climate action, but you can also support youth-led initiatives on what we call citizen science, which is a very simple way of documenting and understanding and generating information about the impact of climate change on our environment or just the general ecology in which we live. So there are different things that IVCOs can do here to engage, and I think probably the final point I'd make on this is, I think the question is, we need to think about young people as equal contributors in program activity. I think we need to think about young people as being program drivers and contributors rather than program outcomes. I think we have to look beyond simply the idea that young people are in youth programs. And I think there's some interesting stuff being developed where young people are being integrated into what's called hybrid models of volunteering, alongside in different ways, whether online or whether or not with older volunteers or whatever. So I think for the challenge for the IVCOs is you need to make sure there are opportunities for young people, and to some extent that tends to be a youth program, but you need to go beyond youth programs, and you need to be thinking about where are the opportunities for young volunteers to learn, not just stay with a kind of notion of a north-south model that's going to continue, and whereby we're just simply flying young people all around the world into other countries. That probably is a model that, that's probably a model that was based on the model of the 1960s, and maybe that's not the best place to start. So I hope that's answered that question. Well,
that's a very brilliant response, Dr. Allum. Thank you so much. And just for me to add a bit on the discussion on whether or not sending volunteers outside is still relevant. Well, so for myself, with YSS, I take pride in knowing that we send, I won't say underprivileged students, but those who don't have the ability, or those who cannot afford to go out on their own. And what we do is that we send these students from polytechnics, community colleges, from a diverse range of backgrounds, so that they can contribute. Number one is to contribute to communities, but number two is also on capacity building, and telling them that they are also agents of change, that they are capable of making changes and making an impact in this world. And the idea, that the theme of IVCO this year is something that is very true to YSS, and I'm just very glad that I'm part of this conversation and I am part of this entire agenda today. And I'm very proud and I'm very happy to have met you, Dr. Allum, and having this conversation with you. So To summarize, you have argued that IVCOs have a responsibility to support youth-led volunteering for development. You have also highlighted the challenges that IVCOs face in doing this. And so at the end, what are some key takeaways for IVCOs that are looking to get started? And, is there anything that you would like to highlight from your blog piece?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is this is not easy stuff to do. Okay, I don't think we should sort of see, oh, well, it's also straightforward and easy, because if it was easy, it would have been done. The question, the takeaways, I think, really, however, is making sure that we are starting from the right places. So I think from an IVCO point of view, my proposition, my challenge to IVCOs is to say, well, do you start from a really a model where youth-led is really center stage in relation to your youth work and your youth programs? Or are you, to what extent do you really have you young people as active contributors, not just in the program, but in the whole design of the approach? And to what extent is it driven from the global south, if that's where you're working, rather than from some sense of a global north concept? Now, this is easy to say, but not always easy to do. And I understand that because I've worked in IVCO, but I think we have to make sure we keep our focus on that. I would also my other takeaway would say is, if we take a global view around bringing young people together, then how do we understand how that works? Has this got to be a physical thing? What is the young people communicate a lot more by social media than, say, the previous generation did, and certainly a lot more than the generation before that. That is changing all the time. So the sense of it is, are we aligning ourselves with those changes as IVCOs? Do we understand the implications of that? How does our approach to engaging and enabling young people to participate in the challenges of development, the challenges of things like climate action, how do we support that process without taking it over? It's their process. How do we support it and enable that to be effective? So I think there's a piece around the design of what we do and making sure that young people are the active generators of the work, and that it's generated from the global south rather than from the global north. And I think there's a piece around ways of working, which is, are we really embracing the changes that are going on? Are we really deeply understanding the implications of how online volunteering can operate, how social media can operate? And by online volunteering, I'm not just talking about someone in the global north with someone in the global south. I'm talking about how young people connect, and how the situation has changed. So much changed since the days when the only way you could find out about what somebody did and how you could feed that back was by, as it were, getting on a boat, or more recently, getting on a plane. It doesn't have to be like that. We can think about this creatively. We can think about this doing things in a different way. So that's the challenge. And I don't think, as someone said to me once, the thing about researchers is they're very good at posing questions rather than solutions. I think that's true. And I think there's questions there, and these are the questions I think IVCOs need to be looking at. And I think IVCOs are entirely capable, sort of brilliant people, capable of working with volunteering organizations, infrastructure organizations, and young people's organizations to find really good outcomes, really good programmatic activities, really good ways of finding they're an appropriate role for the way in which they will operate in supporting the drive and the energy that young people bring to addressing the development challenges and the sustainable development goals.
Thank you so
I think that's
much,
probably
Dr. Allum.
that's probably my takeaways. I hope that's clear.
Well, that's something that is thought-provoking for me, being someone from the global south and also being in the youth-led initiative of volunteering programs in the global south. So being in the participant of that, yeah, that's very clear to me. And the end, just for me, in my perspective, we just want to feel empowered, and we just need to be lifted up so that we can also just help back the community. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Allum, for your time and insights. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. To our viewers and listeners, if you are intrigued by our discussion today, do read Dr. Allum's blog piece, The Role of International Voluntary and Cooperation Organizations, IVCO, in Developing Youth-Led Volunteering for Development, and other brilliant posts at our conference website at www.IVCO2023.org. And most importantly, if you haven't signed up yet, this is the time for you to register yourself for the conference happening from 22 to 26 of October 2023 in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Stay tuned for more episodes of Unpacking IVCO 2023 blog posts. Bye!